Headlines make fans of Zack Snyder's films out to be toxic people who exude reprehensible behavior and have set a dangerous precedent for the film industry. But that just hasn't been my experience.
It's sometimes hard to really enjoy these Zack Snyder DC films because they get crapped on a lot. So it's fun to be around other like-minded people who love these films. They're all people of high quality taste in film.
I've found that fans of Snyder's work can be thoughtful and insightful, and chatting with them provides me with different perspectives that elevate my own personal viewing of the stories. Since I've already shared why I love the cinematic style of Zack Snyder, I wanted to highlight other fans to hear what they love about the work of the visionary filmmaker. So, Damian, I am very excited to talk to you because we actually met at the Full Circle SnyderCon 2023 event in Pasadena, California. And I think I knew of you through Vero, but we had never met in person, which is the case for a lot of the people that I met at SnyderCon. But we had a really great conversation after, I think it was Man of Steel. It was one of those screenings at the art center.
I think it was right before BVS started.
Oh, okay. Yes, yeah. It might have been before the movie. Yeah. So I'm really excited because I had such a good time talking to you. So I am really curious about your perspective and your background and how that informs why you love the things that you do. So I guess because we're talking about films specifically, what really sparked your interest in film?
Not to make my dad look like just the worst dad, but when I was like 10, because I think up to that point in my life, I watched movies. I loved movies. This makes me sound so old, but we would go to Blockbuster on Fridays and Saturdays, and I would rent a VHS, and so like I watched movies. But I think the first one that really got me passionate about film, because it kind of exposed me to the power of film, was I was 10 years old, and my dad let me watch some of John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978. And that movie, dude, that traumatized me. And should he have let me watch it? Probably not. But what it did for me is it helped me to see that film can, for better or worse, move you, right? It has an impact on you.
Even if it's a scary thing.
Yes, exactly. And so I think that's one of the first things that stands out. That's one of the first movies I really remember that had an impact on me. I think two others. One is not a movie at all, but I think it's what really got me interested in storytelling. And I think as a child, it was the first bit of storytelling that I saw that didn't try to dumb itself down for me. And that was Batman, the animated series. I really fell in love with storytelling because of that show, because it wasn't afraid to tackle these dark themes and to look at these characters through a more realistic lens. It's interesting. I think in many respects, even though that was a children's show, it was far more mature than stuff that's coming out of the MCU today. That was great storytelling. I think that was one of my first exposures to it. That's part of what kind of drives me crazy when people stereotype what a Zack Snyder fan is, and they say, oh no, they're just like everything being dark and gritty. They're a bunch of edgelords, right? But like, I think there is something actually very legitimate in this idea of appreciating a darker and more mature vision from your artist. Okay, and I'd say the last movie, and then I'll cut this answer, is I think The Dark Knight. I was in middle school when I saw that, and I realized that film could mean something. And it really kind of blew my mind to sit back and think that maybe it was actually a commentary on the war on terror. Maybe it was an allegory for maybe sort of a defense of Bush era tactics that had been under fire, and basically saying that when you're up against an unethical opponent, sometimes you too use unethical tactics in fighting them. I thought that was really interesting to think about a film as sort of political allegory, and I had never done that before. And of course, then Batman v Superman becomes like the culmination of that, but I won't get into that. So I think it's all of those things that really, the power of film, the power and the value of great storytelling, and the fact that film can mean something. I think all of those things are why I became so passionate about it. And now I teach a film studies course, right? Like I think that all combined to lead me to where I am now.
I think you're a great person to talk about film studies with a class because I talk about meaning a lot. And I think that's so
Mm,
important to have that be part of a story because it doesn't
yeah.
mean anything to you. Why care about it? Why
Yep.
put
Yep.
any investment or effort into it? Yeah, The Dark Knight, I think, was one of those movies where I think it really shocked people. It's like, oh, comic book films can be more than just
Hmm.
comic book stories. They can be
Yeah.
something more. But The Dark Knight was so handled so well that I can see why that would also be an inspiration. Halloween, though, I am a real big chicken. I don't know that I could handle those kinds
I
of movies.
can't blame you.
I loved scary movies when I was younger, but now that I'm
Mm,
old and aware of my own mortality, it's
mm.
harder for me to to watch horror
That's
movies.
real. That's real. I get
um,
it.
yeah, so thank you for sharing about your kind of background with film and what
Yeah.
made you love film. And so I guess since I talk about Zack Snyder and his films a lot on my YouTube
Hmm.
channel, I'm
Hmm.
curious about why did you gravitate towards Zack Snyder films?
So it's interesting. I want to start this with a surprising beginning, which is at first I did not. Um, the first Zack Snyder movie that I saw in theaters, honestly, it may have been the first that I saw, period, was Man of Steel. And the first time I watched it, I have to confess, I was not a fan. Um, and I actually think it's really interesting, going on this arc from being a Zack Snyder hater, after, a couple of viewings of Man of Steel and not really knowing anything else about the guy, to now he's my favorite filmmaker. It's given me a little bit of a sense of that other side, what those detractors, and some of the flaws in their logic. So I'd say there were two reasons that initially I was not a fan of Man of Steel. Number one is I saw the name Christopher Nolan on the movie. I saw that he was a producer. And so what I expected was a super gritty, realistic, um, like basically The Dark Knight all over again. But what we were really getting was um, something that was great in its own right, but was not a Christopher Nolan movie. It was a Zack Snyder movie. Um, And so I think on one hand, I went into it with a completely unrealistic, unreasonable expectation that by the end, by the third act, I remember, one of my other complaints was like, oh, this is just this big, CGI brawl, and I had an issue with that, and as I reflected on it, I realized this it doesn't come down to I'm weighing the art on its own merits. What it came down to was I was being petulant and saying, ah, this isn't the movie I dreamed of, and so I don't like it. And that I think that was a really interesting place to start, right? To be on a different side. Um, in time, I would go back to it and I'd watch it again, even the second time I saw it. Honestly, while I was still rather closed minded, um, I honestly, I remember thinking like, "Okay, maybe I was wrong about this." And third time I saw it, I was like, "Okay, wait, I kinda love this movie." And then before I knew it, I owned it, and I remember, commuting back and forth to college on Amtrak, and I would sit there and I would watch Man of Steel every time. That was like my go-to, like, I gotta watch Man of Steel, and I'd sit there and I'd pick it apart, and I realized, like, I just didn't understand Zack Snyder. Like I just didn't. I hadn't seen one of his movies. I didn't know what he was all about. I didn't know what went into his artistic philosophy. So I guess it's understandable why at that point, I was closed minded. By the time BVS rolled around, I'll be honest. While I wasn't exactly like the biggest Zack Snyder fan in the world, I was ready for it. I'm a Batman fan, so I think that was the height of You know, people talk about Batmania from Batman '89 and
Yeah.
Batman v Superman. That was my Batmania, right? Like that's the most excited I think I've ever been, and perhaps will ever be for any movie. Period. Um, and so I was a little nervous about like how's it all going to come together. I remember I was totally on board with the movie. I got a little nervous after that Doomsday trailer because they showed a lot, and I was like, did it kill my hype because it showed me everything? I wasn't sure, but I went into the movie with my friends and we saw the reviews were bad and we were nervous. And I remember during the gala scene that I turned to my friend and I said, I love this movie. Like, we
Already.
didn't get it. We didn't
Yeah.
get it. The three of us were sitting in a row, like throughout the whole movie, almost in disbelief because everybody had led us to believe, oh, this thing is a dumpster fire. We were like, what is everybody else watching? This is a masterpiece. And, I think that first time I watched it, I just really enjoyed it as a film. But in going back to it, I realized I really think, artistically speaking, it is the most brilliant film I've ever seen that doesn't get the respect it deserves. Just because of the genre that it falls into. Much in the same way that, back in 1958, if you said to somebody that Vertigo would one day be on, the list of Sight and Sound's, top films of all time, they would have laughed because it was a genre film. I think it takes decades of reevaluation to really put something in its proper context and understand it for what it is and appreciate it for what it is. And I think this is one of those films. But now, sorry to come around to your question of
No,
why do
no.
I like why gravitate to Zack Snyder. I think what is so groundbreaking about him that has been such a game changer for me as a viewer of film is that I think there is this fake binary of like style, substance. And I think for many films, sure, right? You can say, oh, that's style over substance, and might be accurate. But I think Zack Snyder has done something that completely upends that dynamic, and it becomes the style is the substance. There's this conception of Zack that he's just sitting around being like, oh, that would be cool. And I think that is how he presents himself sometimes. But there is a double standard, right? Like David Lynch can say, "Oh, I won't analyze my movies. You do that." Right? And nobody says, "Oh, David Lynch doesn't know what he's talking about." Robert Frost can say, "Oh yeah, my poem about apple picking, it's just about apple picking," right? And nobody says, "Robert Frost, he doesn't write about anything of meaning. He's an idiot." And yet for some reason, if Zack Snyder says, "Yeah, I just thought that would be cool," then it's oh, he's an idiot. He's just a bro making movies. The reality is artists don't love to talk about the meaning of their work, but it doesn't change the fact that there's meaning there. And I think this is a guy who there's always meaning there, but also I'm somebody who I don't just want a product, I want a point of view. And he's giving us that point of view. In everything he does, there is a sort of this cohesive philosophy. And I think that's deeply inspiring. So you take those things, you take the fact that, like, as I said, ever since I was a kid, I was so interested in people who are willing to explore those dark, mature themes and really not dumb down for the audience, but challenge us. I mean, he's one of the only people in Hollywood who's really doing that. So much so that a lot of people don't like it, right? They respond with indignation, like, "How dare you make me think about these heroes?" Right? I just wanted these two to punch each other like Rock'em Sock'em Robots. But like, I love that this is a guy who dares to say, "What if I could give you more?" And he's giving us movies that should not exist, but somehow by some miracle they do, and I'm immensely grateful for that. So I don't have enough kind things to say about him. I think he's just the greatest filmmaker, and I wish that people could stop making assumptions about what a Snyder fan feels or like, I think if they took time to analyze his work, they would see it differently.
Yeah, I think there's so much that I want to follow up with you on
Yeah.
because um, what I think is really interesting about your story is that you gave, for instance, Man of Steel many chances. Like you didn't just
Mhm.
say I hate it in the one showing and
Mhm.
then shoved it aside. You went back and
Yeah.
gave it another shot. And I think with Zack Snyder films in particular, you have to. watch them
Mhm.
a couple of
Mhm.
times, even if you're like a really astute, keen-minded person to pick up on a lot of things on the first viewing, you're still going to catch
Yeah.
on more things on the second viewing. So I think
Yeah.
it's admirable that you went back and watched it again, because there are even some movies that I'm like, I'm never picking that up again. It
Right.
offended me so much. I'm never going to pick it up.
That's it.
But I think it's really admirable that you went back to it and gave it a fair shake.
Yeah.
And that opened up the door for you to be open-minded when BVS came out. And I agree with you.
Mhm.
The 2016 hype of BVS has not been replicated for me.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
It's gone downhill since then. But
Oh, yeah.
it was so exciting to be a fan back then.
Yeah.
So I guess what I am wondering about with your story and your perspective is, what do
Mhm.
you think it was that, I guess, encouraged you to go back and look at like Man of Steel again? And
Mhm.
what do you think it is about watching a film several times? Why do you think that
Mhm.
made a difference for you?
So what encouraged me to go back and watch Man of Steel multiple times? That's a really good question. So I think, on one hand, it was that second viewing that probably opened my mind to it more. And really, the only reason I saw it a second time was thanks to my dad, because he was like, "Hey, I haven't seen this movie yet. You want to go see it with me?" And I said, "Well, I saw it, but sure, I'll go see it again." And I think the second time I watched it, I think there are two things about it that opened my mind. One was, I think I walked away with this oversimplified perspective the first time I watched it, that, oh, okay, this movie is just throwing Jesus imagery at us and it doesn't have anything meaningful to say about it besides he's Jesus. And I think, that second time I watched it, I think I realized that there was something more complex and nuanced at play. And I think things that hit me were, I think about, there's an interesting sort of commentary at the beginning, and throughout the whole film, really, about Krypton and their conception of, what it means to have a child, and these ideas about parenthood and how a society should be run. Yeah, there was kind of, I felt there was almost a little like abortion and adoption allegory. Like there was a lot that was actually in there, that when I just sat there and thought, "Oh, this is just dumb CGI. Oh, this is just meaningless Jesus imagery," I didn't really pick up the nuances. And so that second time, I'm grateful that my dad was like, "You want to go see it again?" Because that enabled me to see it and give it another chance. And I think the reason I kept watching after that was I needed to realize more of like, what did I miss? Um, and also on a much more surface level, but like I just really loved disappearing into that world. Like I something just clicked with Snyder's vision of Metropolis and Smallville, and it became kind of just a quintessential comfort watch for me, which made it easier to go back and rewatch it. Which I think is also something unique about his movies, is that often these sorts of art films, they can be hard to go back and rewatch again and again. I don't know if I know anybody, maybe Christopher Nolan, because he's a true film nerd, but I don't know many people who are sitting at home on a Friday night and they're like, I'm just gonna pop in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I don't think, and yet you can pop in any of Zack Snyder's movies and simultaneously analyze it for the entirety of the runtime, but also have a great Friday night watch and enjoy some popcorn, right? It is such almost an impossible balance to establish, and yet he does it every time. And I'm amazed by that.
That's so interesting. Yeah, when I was after Man of Steel came out, I went through cancer treatment, and
Hmm.
one of the things that I would like fall asleep to, just because it helped me sleep, because it was sometimes hard to sleep, was watching Man of Steel. So I would pop that on before, and it would sort of lull me to sleep, like it was comfort food.
Yeah.
And that's why I've always kind of objected to people saying, "Oh, it's dark and gritty," and I'm like, I don't know. I was watching that to get inspiration when I was going through
I,
one of the hardest things I ever went through in my life.
I mean, and I have to say, So I was kind of familiar with your story, and that's part of why I really gravitated toward, connecting with you on Vero and following you and following your story, because I just thought, I thought that was so amazing and so inspiring. And I think, it's just truly like, I, I was thinking about it as I was preparing for our conversation here, that if you had told me, 5, 6 years ago that like eventually you and I would be having this conversation, I think I just, it really does, it means a lot. And so just to say, I think never doubt like the power of you sharing your story. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about this community, is that there's so many inspiring stories out there of people whose lives have been touched by Zack Snyder's work, and changed for the better. There's all this talk about, oh, toxic fandom, but like these are beautiful stories that I'm not hearing about from other fandoms. I don't know. You just always inspired me with that, and so it's really meaningful. When I saw you in Pasadena, I said to my friend, like, normally I'm very shy and reluctant to approach people, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to push myself out of my comfort zone, because this is somebody who has meant a lot to me in this fandom, even though I've never talked to her in person. I got to go like say something. So it's really cool, and again, really inspiring.
Well, I'm so glad you did. Thank you for the kind words, but I'm so
Yeah.
glad that I was excited to meet somebody who actually had some really thoughtful things to share. And I would agree with you that I think a lot of people, when they talk about Zack Snyder fans or fans of just his films, maybe not even him as a person, like you don't have to like
Hmm.
him as a person to like his films, but I think
Hmm.
most people like both. But he draws fans, I think, to his
Hmm.
films who care about the deeper meaning and wanting to
Yeah.
talk about these bigger ideas. Like, one of the things I love about talking to other fans is that somebody might bring a different perspective about things that I don't have. When you were talking about your thoughts about the Krypton culture and how it could be
Hmm.
seen as like an abortion versus adoption thing, I'll be honest, I'd never thought about it that way,
Mm.
and that's
Yeah.
actually really cool to hear
Yeah.
your perspective on that, because I think there are things that you could pull from that related to those subjects, and I think that actually makes it, much more impactful that out of Krypton,
Hmm.
Clark or Cal, for
Hmm.
Krypton, he, gets adopted by this family
Yeah.
who really cares about him, and, he's seen as both a child of Krypton and a child of Earth, so I think there's a
Yeah.
lot that you could write, you could talk about that, and I think that's a really beautiful perspective about it, because it says so much about the ability to, save a child and have free that
Mm.
child have free will and things like that, so
Yeah.
that's a really cool perspective, something that I'm going to think about later a little bit more. But I think you're right that these films have that deep meaning, but they're also really fun to watch. And
Hmm.
I guess this might lead into a good segue, because we've talked a little bit about rewatching films and giving films a fair shake and
Hmm.
how
Hmm.
fun they are to watch, in addition to the deeper meaning and the fun of the ability to analyze films. But
Hmm.
critics don't see them that way. They tend to watch them once for the review, and they watch them
Yeah.
and they don't think they're any fun. So I'm curious, because I did a whole series where I read verbatim through the top critics of Rotten Tomatoes in regard to BBS. And since I know you
Hmm.
love BBS, I'm just curious, where do you think that divide happens? Why do you think that happens, where fans like us might be willing to give it a fair shake and actually
Hmm.
enjoy analyzing films, but for the people who get paid to do that, they don't seem to do that as we do. So why do you think there's that big divide?
Uh, so I think part of it, it's interesting, because some would say, well, critics, no, they do respect comic book movies. Look at how positively they've received the MCU. I think I think what people don't realize is that I think the MCU, again, like, some of the films, I should really say movies, some of the Marvel movies, I can appreciate. But I think that what Marvel has really done with the MCU is pandered to critics by being so comedic and kind of undercutting the power of their stories, and I don't know, in some ways, like, satirizing, the genre, and kind of I don't want to say disrespecting, but I think they've tried to take this sort of like sly approach of like, ah, comics are kind of absurd, so we're just going to lean into that, right? We're just going to have Tony Stark and Doctor Strange talking about Ben and Jerry's flavors in the middle of a movie that really has no room for that, right? And so um, I think they earned this degree of goodwill from critics who have this sort of elitist perspective toward comic books and stories about, you know, just men in spandex, right? And I think unfortunately, then there gets to be this sense of like, oh yes, that's what all comic book movies should be. You know, they can realize that they're absurd and they can make fun of themselves and not pretend to be any smarter than those dumb stories really are. So that's what Zack Snyder's movie should be too. And so there, you start to weigh it against that absolutely absurd, unfair sort of set of criteria that these elitist critics establish. And of course, somebody like Zack Snyder who's coming in and saying, no, you know, I want to treat this like modern mythology. You know, I want to take this really reverent, serious, mature, dark approach to it. You know, these critics are they don't respond well to it because they never respected the source material. I think that's where sort of that divide comes in. Is you have these successful superhero movies that came in and kind of cultivated demand for less reverent, less serious, more I don't know, products that were willing to almost be predicated on this notion that superhero stories are absurd. And unfortunately that played well with critics and Zach's approach did not. I think fans and audiences have been willing to give that dark approach a shot because not everybody is an elitist and is coming at it from this perspective of comics are dumb. Many of us have actually realized, you know, take a step back, like, no, these are meaningful stories. There's an article that I teach where, you know, somebody talks about the Marvel movies and the fact that, you know, everybody's acting like comics suddenly became respected. And this guy makes the argument, no, they haven't become respected. These movies like tried to dumb themselves down, to pander. And so the respect that we're getting is only the respect of like, oh yeah, you made a good roller coaster ride, right? But you made it, that was a diverting light show. You know, I enjoyed my popcorn for 2 hours and went home and never thought about it again. Good job. That became the barometer, you know, that people use to say, oh, that's what a fun movie is. Listen, I think Batman v Superman is a fun movie.
I
I think,
agree.
you know, like that again, it's that gala scene where I said to my friends, like, this is a lot of fun. Like, I really enjoy this back and forth and that banter between them and the, you know, the Alfred saying, you know, some woman from Metropolis will make you honest in your dreams, Alfred, right? Like all of that stuff, you know, people are saying, oh, it's humorless. Again, it's just because it wasn't Marvel. And just like how I went into Man of Steel and had this absolutely absurd expectation that this just be Christopher Nolan all over again, people went into Batman v Superman and Man of Steel and Justice League with the mindset of this should be Marvel, and that's not fair.
Yeah, I think that's actually a large portion of it. In my experience in reading those
Hmm.
reviews, they mentioned Marvel movies quite a bit. Some of them even mentioned, "Oh, Joss Whedon would do this better," which in hindsight is laughable and
Yeah, we see
comedic.
how well that went.
Yeah, they got their wish, I
Yeah.
guess.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
but I think that is a large portion of it that people brought their expectations onto it, and that's
Mhm.
what caused them to think about it a certain way instead of actually looking at it for what it is. And that's something that I have to keep in mind when I'm personally reviewing something. If I review something for Supergirl Radio, if I'm talking about something for my YouTube channel, I make sure that I watch something at least twice. Because I want to give something a fair shake, make sure that I've looked at it as deep as I can go.
Yeah.
And sometimes I do find something on the rewatch, and sometimes I don't. Sometimes it is
Mm,
just a superficial story, and that's what it is.
yeah.
And that's that's maybe how it was meant, the way it was made. So
Sure.
not every movie is going to have that kind of, the levels that you keep hitting
Mhm.
as you keep digging. But I think with critics, that job is, you watch a movie, then you write an article,
Mhm.
then you watch
Mhm.
another movie, you write another review. And
Yeah.
it's very, to them, I could see how it would be tedious to keep doing that. So,
Yeah.
I don't know what it is about the Marvel movies that so set a precedent for a lot of that, but I think it was just the sheer volume of those movies,
Yes.
just kind of established a genre on its own. The MCU
Mhm.
became its own genre. So I
It
think I think that is pretty unfair to judge other comic book films to that
it's
standard.
I mean, and I don't know why, like, that the 2010s were for seemingly almost all of Hollywood were this post-Avengers era where everything had to be the Avengers, whether it be in terms of tone, whether it be in terms of box office success. That's what I always found absurd is if you look at how Man of Steel and Batman v Superman performed, that's when WB really second guessed Zack and kind of tried to reverse course on his vision for this universe. But I mean, compare that with where the MCU started instead of comparing it with what they built up to with the Avengers, and it was really impressive. But you're right, it became this all-consuming, like everything must be the Avengers. And I remember back in 2012, like everybody just adored the Avengers, and I never got it. Like I just yeah, I was like, you guys are acting like it's a cinematic masterpiece, but like, meh,
I
it just
had
wasn't for me.
I felt like somebody yelling in the wilderness after the Avengers. I thought I was the only person who felt like that, because I
Same.
remember I remember being very excited about it because I really liked phase 1 of the MCU, and so I was really excited
Yeah,
to see all those characters together, and when I saw it, I
yeah.
was like, "Are all the actors just phoning it in this movie?" And so
Yes.
I was really disappointed that they didn't seem to the acting wasn't really bringing it, and the story was kinda so-so, and
Mhm.
so I thought I was the only one who was like, "Yeah, I mean, it was good, but it wasn't the greatest movie I've ever seen." So I've always felt like I was like the only person in the world who ever felt like that. So I
It
appreciate your thoughts on that, Damian.
Well, and I mean, that's the cool thing too, right? Is that in a way, like Zach, not to be cheesy or anything, but like he really did unite all of us in terms of like there were so many of us who we just that Avengers vision of superheroes and of storytelling that didn't resonate with us. And I think we wanted something more. Somehow we had this opportunity to have this guy, no matter what happened with the universe, even though it ended up, not working out the way that we wish it had. I think he did a world of good in showing us that like there was another option and we didn't have to be subject to the tyranny of the majority on this, like, everything must be the Avengers. To your point, like I remember watching that movie and thinking that it was like what's that Adam Sandler movie, Grown Ups, where it's not a movie at all. It's just Adam Sandler and his friends getting together to hang out and just make a trashy movie. Like I really, that's what the Avengers felt like to me. There was no why to it besides we're gonna make a bunch of money. Let's just get together and make this thing.
I think it is interesting to note that the MCU, that first phase 1 was a little more serious, had more meaning. The
Hmm.
first Thor movie is like a Shakespeare drama. Captain
Yeah.
America, the first Avenger, is a good war movie that has a lot of
Hmm.
heart with that relationship with Peggy. And
Yeah.
Iron Man starts off as a guy who's creating weapons of war. Like, I mean, these are all very serious topics. And so I think when it got to the Avengers and it got a little silly,
Hmm.
I started to lose interest, and it just kept
Yes.
getting worse after that, in my opinion. But
Yes.
I think there are different kinds of fans, and some
Hmm.
people, like you mentioned, just want to have a good time in the theater and go home full with popcorn, and then some people
Yeah.
want to digest something and really take something in. And so
Yeah.
I think those kinds of people like you and like me
Hmm.
are always going to want that out of any movie, no matter what it is. So I think that's maybe a good segue to talking about Batman v Superman, because I like to ask this question to Snyder fans
Hmm. Hmm.
of Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and Zack Snyder's
Hmm.
Justice League, which is your favorite? And I have heard so many people tell me BVS was their favorite. And so I'm curious. I know that is your answer. So
Yes.
why is that the favorite of the three for you?
Why is it my favorite? Well, okay. It's my favorite of the three, I think, for a few reasons. One, just in terms of what I've been talking about Zack Snyder being this just one of a kind art film director who makes these movies that are just operating on another level. I think of the trilogy, BVS is the culmination of that, right? I think again, there is a lot to pick apart in Man of Steel. Um, Zack Snyder's Justice League, there's also a lot to pick apart, and it's a beautiful film. And I would honestly, I'd have a really hard time telling you which of those would be my number two in the trilogy. I that would be really difficult. But I always I think that as an art film, as a real like quintessential thesis from Zack Snyder on what it means to be a hero and what mythology is and what comics are. If there were one movie I wanted to show somebody so that they could understand what a Zack Snyder movie is and the beauty and the power and the meaning of it, it would have to be Batman v Superman. The other reason I say that, on top of just the fact that I think it's so rare that not only was that the most hype I've ever experienced for any movie ever, but like it surpassed everything that like a couple days into it, before it came out, I was nervous and I had been hyped, but I was starting to be like, maybe I'm wrong. And so to go into it and watch it and be like, no, I love this even more than I expected a few days ago. And I certainly have, all these fond memories of just being in college with my friends and us getting out of that movie. And I lie to you not, we stood outside and talked about it for 3 hours straight,
I
and
believe it.
and that was only the beginning, right? Like, little did I know that was only the beginning. But I think the other thing too, just to, like, really one of the biggest reasons I would say BVS is, no exaggeration, I think it changed my life. Because at that point where I was in my life, I knew I wanted to be a teacher, but I was going back and forth between I love history, I love English. Which direction am I going to go with my life? What do I want to be working with students on? Um, and I watched that movie and I seriously walked away from it being like, no, English. Like what I want to do with my life is help students to see that art is not just powerful, it's meaningful.
Mm.
The work that I have to do as a viewer sitting there saying, look at Lex, he's wearing that shirt with Banksy's monkey detonator on it. Okay, the monkey's destroying the bananas, which it eats for its sustenance. It's destroying something it needs. Is the film trying to say to us right now that like in trying to kill this god, like Lex is actually destroying something that he himself needs. That sort of work, that sort of analysis of every little detail. It was like a novel on screen. And I just knew that I wanted to spend the rest of my life working with students to think on that level. And so when I met Zach back in was that April now? Was that March?
Yeah, April
When
2023. Yes.
Yeah, and when I met him, I just, I had to tell him like that really, I think I could give no higher praise to BBS than it really did change my life. It's why I'm doing what I'm doing right now, and now I teach the film in my film studies class. And not only do I teach the film in my film studies class, we spend an entire week on it. We have a whole unit that just builds up to it, and then we have a week that's just devoted to picking apart BBS. And I could use more time than that. I actually jokingly, but it ended up being serious. I designed an entire curriculum for a class where I would just spend the whole semester teaching it. And I'm considering maybe one day trying to teach that because I really think there's so much there. So
I
yeah.
love this. I think it's great. I have always
Yeah.
thought that BPS should be studied in school.
Yeah.
So I think this is awesome. And I think you're a great person to do that because you really think
Thank
about
you.
these things. And I think one of the things I hope for the next generation of possible filmmakers, of possible film critics, are people who do look for those things because
Mhm.
everything is intentional in a film. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, but the camera shots, the writing, the costumes,
Yes.
the acting, the
Yes.
blocking, everything is so thought out. And so
Yeah.
I'm glad that you're encouraging your students to think through those things and really
Mm.
work through them, because sometimes you have to consider, like, why would his t-shirt have that on there? What does that say about his character? What does that
Yeah.
say about the world that he lives in? What does that say about
Yeah.
his motivations? Those are
Yeah.
all great questions to ask, and it makes my day knowing that somebody is teaching BBS and getting people to challenge themselves in regards
Yeah.
to filmmaking and film criticism. And I personally am of the opinion that good film criticism and good film analysis makes for better art. It makes
Mhm.
better filmmakers. I remember there was a quote from Kevin Smith where he said one of the best ways to have better art is to encourage filmmakers. I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember it exactly, but I have thought about that so much. And I think when you analyze a film poorly, and then you
Mhm.
crap on it and crap on it and crap on it, it's not going to
Yep.
encourage a filmmaker to do
Yeah.
something challenging again.
Yep.
So I think that is such a great thing that you're doing with your students, and I am so glad that BBS had such a powerful and important impact on your life, because I think good filmmaking, good art can do that. So I
Yeah.
think that's amazing. Just out of curiosity, do you have
Yeah.
a favorite scene in BBS that sort of encapsulates all that
Mm.
for you?
First of all, I just wanna say quickly, thank you, and to make your day just a little more, just FYI, overwhelmingly, students walk away from that unit being like, "Yeah, that's a great film. I don't know what people are talking about."
I love
Which is
that.
like so just FYI. I'm trying to do my part. Okay, a
That's
favorite
good. I like
scene,
it.
it's not the most original scene to say, but it's the rooftop scene. Lex's monologue, the fact that the movie grapples so directly and so, like, unflinchingly with the problem of evil, this grand theological concept in a movie that otherwise people would have shown up and just expected some popcorn movie about two dudes punching each other, right? Like, I was so impressed by that. I also just continue to think that Jesse Eisenberg gives one of the greatest ever performances as Lex. And I think it's just people having a preconceived notion of what they wanted Lex to be and not being open-minded to what this new interpretation was. But stories and characters can never go anywhere if you don't let them evolve in natural organic ways that work for their story, and that worked for the story. His idea of if God cannot be all powerful, he cannot be all good, right? Like, this writing is just Terrio on another level, and that combination of Terrio and Snyder, I think, is really hard to top. Combined with that performance, how can you not smile gleefully when he says, "When you came here, you had an hour. Now it's less."
Less.
You
Yeah.
know, it just gives me chills. So it has to be that scene. I that there are so many scenes in the movie, but I think if I had to choose one, I'm gonna say rooftop scene.
Yeah, when people say, BBS is not fun, I always think about, I think it's the beginning of that scene where he has the kitchen clock and he says,
Yes, the
"Mother of
timer. Yep.
God, mother of God, would you look at the time?" I just love that so much because it plays into
Yep.
the, man versus God theme, and so I really enjoy that. I mean, that's a great scene.
And he's such a troll in that moment, right? Of like, because the mother of this god is in danger, and
Yeah,
so
he's
like,
kidnapped her, yeah.
yeah, it's so good.
Yeah, it is a fantastic scene, and I would
Mhm.
agree with you about Jesse Eisenberg, and his version of Lex Luthor. That was one of the things that David Goyer even said when he
Mhm.
was doing Man of Steel. Superman was an ember. He was a Jurassic Park uh,
Yep.
fossilized amber that
Yeah,
that Superman couldn't get out of, and so
yeah,
those characters have to grow at some point and have to have different takes. I would love to see
yes.
different takes on all these characters all the time. I think that's the fun of it. And
I
you can bend them a little bit, but you don't have to break them. But you can bend them a
right,
little bit.
exactly.
So that is great. So thank you for teaching a scholarly analysis of BBS. So needed, so needed in the world. You're doing
Hey,
a real service.
I trust me, I'm always excited to pick apart BBS.
You said your students walk away
Mhm.
with a positive idea of BBS. Do
Yep.
they bring anything to those conversations that maybe you hadn't thought about previously?
Yes, I think some of their insights on kind of their reading of Jesse Eisenberg's Lex and that character and his relationship with his father. You know, it's amazing that all these years later, all these viewings later, I can still have that conversation with them and walk away seeing something just a bit different and having an even greater appreciation.
And, I would be remiss if I didn't follow up on the class
Mhm,
discussion because,
mhm,
I find this so amazing. So I have a lot of
yeah,
questions about your class. So how do
yeah.
you go about teaching? I assume you do you teach other films during the spring semester, or is it just a like
Yeah.
a BBS focus thing?
There's a core film that we'll use for each unit. And so BVS is part of the first unit that is focused on reading images, kind of this introduction to how do we analyze art. And so, like it literally starts off, even though it's a film studies course, I like to start it off at the level of here's a painting, make observations, analyze those little details, and then let's make an argument about what the work means, right? As a whole, what's it trying to communicate? And so we start there, and I think that works perfectly. And I think BVS ends up being a perfect choice for the unit because it involves so many references to art,
Mm,
of course, also to religion and mythology and what have you, but so many, like Cleon Patterson's mural in the back there in the gala, A
mhm,
Balance of Terror, right?
mhm.
And so what we do basically in that week of analysis of BVS, the first day is kind of this, okay, there is so much to unpack from this movie. Let's sit in a circle and let's like, what notes did you take? What questions do you have for each other? Like, we need to just talk about the characters. We need to talk about the narrative, the themes. And so that's kind of our big picture. Like, we need to unpack this together. And then what the next few days are is actually close reading days where I go through and I give them an image of A Balance of Terror. I give them Michael and Satan, that famous painting that he references in the stained glass in the Wayne's mausoleum there in that dream sequence, or maybe rather that nightmare
Yeah, you
when
could
Bat
say it,
or
it's a
that
nightmare.
creature, yeah. And so like I have that painting, I have all these different works that he alludes to, whether it be paintings, whether it be other films. And essentially, each day we walk through a certain number of them together and they analyze the art, but then they have to take it a step further and talk about, okay, why is Zack Snyder putting this stained glass image in the midst of this scene? Like, what does Michael and Satan have to do with Batman going to visit his mom's grave, and what role is it playing in this conflict between him and Superman? And we really have these fascinating discussions about how there's kind of this conversation between the artwork, because that's what Zach does so well. I think that's what he's interested in, is his art responding in many respects to other art. And so that kind of um, is the next 3 or 4 days. I also like to have a day at the end of our BVS analysis where we do have to come back to that really big, very complicated question of, it's trying to communicate many things, but like, what's one thing that we can clearly say we think that Zack Snyder's trying to communicate, whether it be about the nature of heroism, whether it be about God, whether it be right. And so they kind of choose what area of focus they really want to look at, and they try to develop that strong claim about it. And it's so interesting to see where they take it. The only other thing I haven't mentioned is that every day I do you remember the Vero competition? I forget what it was called, to like find the Easter eggs in the film.
The best one was judged, I think, by Zack Snyder and Chris Terrio.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it was
yeah.
called like BVS reference or something.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
That's one of those things that just made me love this film even more. Um, I've taken so many of those and turned it into this, like, you know, other details that brilliant fans have found, cool details that you've probably missed. And so, like, every day on top of just the close reading, on top of just that discussion that we have, I also break down like the address behind where the Waynes are shot is 2337. This is a reference to Revelations, and their bodies shall lie in the streets of a great city, right? And so, like, just all of these details that, again, like, there's no way the students can't walk away from that week saying, okay, that's brilliant. Anytime that I would ever say to myself, man, was I meant to be a teacher? Like that week? Yeah, 100%. Like I can't imagine doing anything else. It's a dream.
I have two different ways that I could go from here.
Mhm.
I guess because you mentioned fans, and
Yeah.
what has been bothersome to me. I'm sure
Mhm.
a lot of like genuine, really thoughtful fans of
Mhm.
Zack Snyder's work
Mhm.
find take issue with is being called a toxic fan. Zack Snyder
Yeah.
fans have been labeled to be toxic, oftentimes by high up Warner Brothers executives. So
Yeah.
what do you make of that label, and do you think it's fair?
You know, toxic is a word that throughout the years I've questioned, what does it actually mean? And do the people who throw it at us actually know what it means? Because I remember, and now I've completely gotten out of it. But there was a time where I was on Twitter, and I was part of the whole release the Snyder cut, and trying to support all of that. Um, but it's interesting. Never once, was I disrespectful of anyone. Never once, certainly I was willing to engage in debates with people online about the merits of Snyder's movies. Um, and, people would call me toxic. And it became very apparent to me that toxic was a term that was being thrown at us for being too passionate about something that they didn't agree with, right? I think, like, not to open up a whole other can of worms, but I think we all know that Twitter can just be an outright cesspool. And
What? I can't
yeah, I
imagine.
know that might come as a surprise. And Twitter has been this breeding ground of, like, okay, let's find people's past statements and let's cancel them. I just think there's a double standard of, it's okay for some people to be passionate, but if we don't agree with you, then you're toxic, right? And so in some respects, until somebody really gives me a definition, sure. Listen, I have no doubt that there are legitimately, some bad apples out there. I have no doubt that's the case in any fandom, and yet it only people only want to zoom in on the bad apples or on the supposed bots, when it comes to the Snyder fandom. And I just, again, I can't help but think that it's a way to silence or invalidate a group that in many respects has proven to be a bit countercultural for this particular time and place in an era where it feels like it seems like maybe the majority has resonated with this sort of MCU style of filmmaking. Oh, they're the punching bag, and they don't agree with us, and so, like, we can just say they're toxic. We can throw the joke into the Barbie movie and just act like it's a bunch of, like, toxic men who have too much time on their hands.
I think you're onto something with the use of the word toxic
Hmm.
as a means somewhat to silence people. I
Hmm.
think I saw that pretty early on after Man of Steel came out. I always tell this
Hmm.
story of, and I'll just repeat it again in case people hadn't heard, but I was a panelist at Dragon Con that, I guess that would have been that August, September after Man of
Hmm.
Steel came out.
Hmm.
And I was like the only person on the panel of a couple, I don't know, it was probably 4 or 5 people. I can't remember now. It was like the only person who liked Man of Steel. And so after the panel was over, I had 2 different people, I don't think they were together, come up to me after the panel wanting to talk to me about Man of
Hmm.
Steel. And they were
Hmm.
sort of whispering in sort of whispered tones, as if they were scared to talk about it, as if they
Hmm.
were somewhat, not ashamed, but like didn't want other people to hear them. And
Yeah.
the I forget the story that the young man told me, but he felt like a personal connection to it. And
Hmm.
this woman who was there told me this really wonderful story about, she had a friend of hers who had a son, I think, with Asperger's,
Mm.
and the scene with Martha and young Clark when he hides in the closet, that
Yeah.
connected with her friend, and she was
Yeah.
like, that's a really big deal for them. And so the fact that these people didn't feel like they could speak up and share that during the panel with other fans, and they had to come to me in like whispered tones because they saw me as somebody, oh, she liked the movie, I can talk about it with her.
Right.
That I remember that being such a strange thing in terms of like, if you like it, you should be able to talk about it. And I just
Yes.
felt so bad for those people. And then I also shared that sort of fear. Like I'd go to Dragon Con and be ostracized out of other
Mhm.
panels that didn't have anything to do with the Zack Snyder or DC. It was,
Yeah.
underwater basket weaving, and they would still bring up how much they hate Zack Snyder. And
Well,
so I just think that like right from the get-go, there was always this uh bullying tactic that nobody really talks about. But I think long-term Snyder fans, I
mhm.
wonder if to a degree that we all kind of felt that in some way, because I know I sure did.
As you're mentioning Dragon Con, I'm remembering a few years ago you posting about, didn't they initially have a panel that was just Snyder bashing?
Yeah.
And maybe they canceled it or something.
I was gonna
Yeah.
go. It was intentionally going to be a panel where they just crapped on Zack Snyder, and I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna show up." And,
But, like
when I got to the door, they said that
uh-huh.
the panel had been canceled, and I think I heard later that the guy had gotten sick, so that's not I
I
hope
see.
I hope he got
Yeah,
better, I hope he felt better,
but it
but
wasn't canceled because they were like, "Oh, this is the wrong thing to do." It was canceled because he couldn't be there.
right, yeah, but I
Interesting.
was gonna totally go and ask him
Yeah.
some really tough questions.
I
I was gonna be a thorn in that guy's side,
Good.
and,
Yeah.
really, really pick apart, because I don't know if this has been your case, but sometimes when I would talk to people, I used to have dialogue, just as you mentioned, with people on
Mhm.
Twitter. I would be like, "Okay,
Mhm.
tell me why you didn't like BVS, or
Yep.
tell me why you didn't like
Exactly.
Man of Steel." I
Exactly.
would welcome that dialogue, and would
Yep.
go on for a while, but
Mhm.
some people just didn't really like, they had a lot of holes and the flaws in the
Yep.
logic. They didn't really understand seem to understand it. And so
Yep.
I think if you went to a panel like that, you could
Mhm.
probably because I know, especially since you teach BVS, you probably are familiar with all the criticisms, and
Yeah.
I'm sure that you could, if somebody brought those criticisms to you, you could rebut them fairly well. But I don't think if you took the positive mentions of, like, for example,
Mhm.
BBS to that panel
Mhm.
where he wanted to hate Zack Snyder, he wouldn't know what to do
No.
with that. He's
No.
probably
Of
not
course not.
familiar with the other side that has studied the
Yes.
paintings and studied the meaning.
It's
So yeah, there was a panel like that, but
it's
fortunately or unfortunately, it didn't come to pass.
it's easy to operate like that when you exist in an echo chamber, right? And I think like that's so much of what people try to establish, not just on Twitter, but on social media is, all right, I'm just going to insulate myself in a bubble of people who agree with me. And they don't like it when you try to pop that bubble. But I also think like, wait, are we the toxic ones? Or like the people who are making us feel like, we have to be quiet about our fandom, is that not just inherently toxic? I remember when I was in college, I was an RA, and I had a bulletin board because I was so excited for BVS. I had a bulletin board it was themed based on Man of Steel and BVS and like this build up to this movie. I was so excited. And I remember it was move-in week, and a grown man, probably in his 50s, he knocked on my door, and I introduced myself. I was cordial. I thought he was just saying hello. And then he said, "I noticed that you're a Man of Steel fan." And he was so serious about it. And I was like, "Yeah, I love that movie. Like I love Zack Snyder." And he said, "That's interesting because that is not Superman."
Oh my gosh.
And like I it was a little aggressive about it and said, like, "It's a little embarrassing that you have that board. That is not Superman." And, like, kinda just walked away. And I remember thinking, like, "You would swear I insulted this dude's kid or something." Like, he was that offended by the fact that I liked a movie. Is that not kind of toxic?
I felt that to a degree, too, sometimes, where it's like, why can't I just like a movie? Why is this not
Yeah.
okay for me to like this version of Superman? I
Yep.
remember objecting to something one time. The Superman homepage typically does a very good job of including
Mhm.
all kinds of Superman fans. But there was one post that they made, I think on Facebook or something, and it said something about it. It basically insinuated that Zack Snyder fans were not Superman fans. And I was just like, I can't believe you did this. I cannot believe you did this. And that's something I'm trying to work through, trying to be
Yeah.
forgiving and
Yeah.
show grace to other
Yeah.
Superman websites. But
Yeah.
it's one of those things where, I'm supposed to, according to other Superman fans or whatever, I'm supposed to love the
Mhm.
Christopher Reeve version when
Right.
there are a lot of issues I take with that one. I think he has a lot of problems from
Yeah.
those movies, and I don't think they really hold up well. If you go back and rewatch them now, there's some questionable things in there, and so
Right.
it's like I might not like some of the Christopher Reeve stuff, but I get why he's popular. I get why people
Yes.
like that version of Superman. I get why, I love Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher on Lois and
Mhm.
Clark. Some people hate that
Mhm.
show. That's fine. It's not their thing. I love it.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, a lot of people love Smallville. I'm kind of on it, like it's
Yeah.
okay to have versions of a character that you like or you don't like.
Yep.
It's just about, for me, it's about how do you treat those people you disagree with.
Mhm.
And I think that's,
Mhm.
we could have a larger, longer
Yes.
conversation about how
Yes.
I think as a society, we don't do well anymore about being tolerant
Yes.
of
No.
other people's thoughts. And
Yes.
I think for me, it's like if I practice being able to disagree with somebody about Superman, maybe I can
Mhm.
be able to disagree with people about larger, more important issues.
No,
Um,
that's a great point.
but yeah, so I think
Yeah.
it's something that we really should practice. And I'm sorry you had that experience. I don't know what that
Hey,
man thought
it's
he was going to accomplish by mentioning that. But
it's it, it was
I
it was
yeah.
such a bizarre encounter. Like just but it just quickly to your point about, Christopher Reeve. It is this strange I don't know, maybe it's something about human nature of like Avengers does well. All superhero movies must be the Avengers. You know, Superman 78, obviously beloved. Every Superman movie must be Superman 78. You're thinking about canon, you're thinking about who Superman is as a character. Like people act as though Superman 78 is the end all be all. That is what Superman is. I mean, there's a whole world of source material out there that is not that. For me, just growing up as a post, I never ever experienced that sort of like Christopher Reeve Superman. That was never my generation. That wasn't really the closest I got. Superman the animated series and Justice League, that Bruce Timm, verse, frankly, I think is not a Christopher Reeve Superman. That is not my conception of what the character is. I was very familiar with things like Injustice before BBS, and so in my conception of the character, Superman Red Sun, that was something that was influential to me. And so I feel like there are people talking for me about like what Superman is when I think Superman can be different things to different people. It goes to I don't know if you're familiar with Andy DiGenova and Holy Backcast,
Oh
and
yeah.
they always talk about. I've listened to them forever now, but they always talk about it's why they have menus at restaurants, right? Like not everybody's going in and ordering the same thing. Fair, right? But so why do you have to stand up and say, why did you order the cheeseburger? You're an idiot.
Yeah.
Like let me order my thing. You order a steak, whatever.
I think it also, especially when you come from a comic book background, it depends on what comics you've read and what
Yes.
comic iteration, what era
Mhm.
that movie or that TV show you're talking about is based on.
Yep.
Superman 78 is based entrenched in the Silver Age. The Silver Age Superman
Mhm.
is a different Superman to the
Yes.
Bronze and Modern Age Superman, which is what Henry Cavill embodies. So
Yep.
there's a lot of different ways in which you can approach those characters and evaluate those characters. And I guess the last thing that I want to ask you,
Yeah.
because you teach, I would say you teach film criticism is what you're doing. And so I guess one of the things that I asked Zack Snyder, because I was
Mhm.
curious about his take on it as a filmmaker, and this is a
Mhm.
question that I'd like to ask everyone that I chat with is
Yeah.
How do you approach a film? How do you
Mm,
evaluate the merits of a film? Do you go into it
mm,
saying I want it to be good or bad, or what do you have a standard? Do you have a like a series of
mm.
things that criteria that you're judging it on? So how do you approach a film in order to evaluate it?
So I think the first time I watch it, truly, like, um, I'll be totally honest. The first time I watch a movie, my goal is as much as possible to get lost in the experience of watching it, really to immerse myself in it. And so, um, I whereas I can be an overanalyzer of like, "Oh, man, okay, this scene in the water, like, that's baptismal imagery. Hmm, okay." I try as much as possible the first time to silence that, to not be thinking about like, "Okay, what plot twist is coming up? Okay, who could be behind this?" I really wanna go along for the ride, and I think there is something so beautiful about that first time that you watch, a great film, and you're just completely, just swept away and surprised by it. And so every time I go into a movie the first time, I just want to experience it on that sort of like emotional, immersive level. But I think the second time is where I really start to evaluate. And that's where I start to say, okay, what have I missed? Um, if all art is communicating something or reveals something, at least, what's being said or what's being revealed. And so, you know, um, not every work needs to be an art film. Not every work needs to be Zack Snyder. Here is a novel on film. I realize that's just not every movie. Um, my wife and I saw Lisa Frankenstein. Certainly not a smart movie by any means. I kind of enjoyed it
Yeah.
as a sort of just love letter to campy horror, but also to movies like Heather's. I thought I really enjoyed it. Is it anything all that thought provoking? No, but I can appreciate it as just an entertaining movie. But I think y- your question of like what do I really how do I evaluate it? How do I decide whether it's whether it's a great film or not? Or I guess part of that goes to I try to get a good understanding of what I think the artist was going for. Because I think, again, too often I've made the mistake, and I think many people have made the mistake of evaluating the art on terms that the artist never intended for it to be evaluated on, right? Zack Snyder did not go making Man of Steel saying, "Oh, this is going to be just like Christopher Nolan," right? That was my expectation that I saddled the film with, and that was not reasonable. And so I try to understand what was the artist going for. I can sit and watch Lisa Frankenstein and say, okay, I'm pretty certain that Zelda Williams was not trying to make an earth-shattering, philosophical commentary. And so I'm gonna have to take this for what it is. I can appreciate that. I think when I realize that a film is trying to do something more and is trying to challenge us in some way, I'll be honest, yes, I think I am more likely to respond positively to that because frankly, we know how Hollywood works. You don't have to challenge people, and in fact, not challenging people often results in more mainstream success, right? So when people take the risks and do it and give me something challenging and give me something meaningful and give me something that I can chew on for days and weeks and months afterwards, instead of something that, I sat there for 2 hours and all right, yeah, it was fun. I'll never think about it again. I have to respect that. This is a conversation I've actually had. There's another teacher at my school who has something called the bad movies club where they watch bad movies. But I've had this conversation where I say, if a movie is genuinely trying to say something, even if the execution is flawed, the fact that it was ambitious enough to try, I am always going to grade on a little bit of a curve compared with a movie that has no higher ambitions and is just okay, right? I will always look at this is another horror movie example, but sure, I'll recognize this is not a great movie. Halloween 3: Season of the Witch is this weird movie that acts in a very strangely ambitious way. Like, they decided in the middle of this franchise about a dude in a Halloween mask who goes around stabbing people. They decided, wait, let's make a movie that's actually just a commentary on the commercialization of Halloween and how bizarre that actually is, and like what the roots of the holiday actually are, and like what does it mean that all these companies have exploited that and are profiting on it. A weirdly ambitious movie that is not well executed, but I would always take that over something like Thor Ragnarok, where you haven't tried to do anything more than make a comedy and put on a light show for your audience. I'll always take the bad but ambitious movie over that. And I don't know if I can fully say that's a bad movie, because at least the artist had a vision and had a purpose and was trying to accomplish something and contribute something to society. I don't know if I can fully say it's a bad movie so much as maybe the execution was bad, but the art was meaningful. So that's not the clearest answer in the world, but I think that's really like I will grade it on a curve if it's ambitious, it's trying to say something, and also if it's the work of an auteur, if it's somebody who has a real point of view and a real philosophy. If I can walk away from a movie and say, I can tell who that movie was made by. I respect that. In an era of, these soulless corporate, like, conveyor belt movies that Hollywood just turns out, I really appreciate a movie having some soul to it. That, again, even if it's not a great movie, I've been maybe to an embarrassing degree. I've been a proponent of like sometimes I think Rob Zombie it gets too much crap when I think at least he has a vision. At least like he owns his style and he knows what he does and he doesn't care if you have a problem with him putting his wife in his movies. There's something wholesome about that, So I like, people said, "Oh my gosh, the Monsters, what a horrible movie." I enjoyed it. At least the man had a vision and you could tell he made it, and like, so I'm always gonna be preferential to that. Give me a point of view, give me some purpose, have some ambition, and even if it's flawed, even if it's not great, right? Like, I'm still more interested in going along for that ride. I think some of those are actually my favorite movies.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to that old Senator Finch question. How do we
Mhm.
determine what's good? I think about that a lot. So I
Yes.
appreciate you taking us through your thought process through that. And I am lying to you. I have one more question because I think I need to establish this throughout
Yeah.
all my conversations with people. And this is a very big question, and I did not prepare
Alright.
you for this. But I'm curious to see how you might answer it because we've been talking about this the whole time, but we never established what
Mhm.
we think this thing is. So, what, in your opinion, is art? How would you
Mm.
define art?
So we talked about this in my class, and one of the texts that we study is it's a book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. Because my film studies class, I actually also build in some comics with it because I think the two each medium is intertwined. You can take a film strip and kind of assess it in a similar way to how a comic operates, and I think Zack Snyder is keenly aware of that. Um, and anyway, Scott McCloud, besides just analyzing comics, he also has this sort of thesis on what art is. Um, and his take is that art is anything that is not necessary for reproduction or survival. Anything else that exists really exists as art. Um, I think that's an interesting sort of perspective. And I suppose to some extent I can get behind that, but I think the caveat that I would add is he talks a lot about the work of an artist, of a creator, being something that um, it has to come from some place that is really like there's a purpose for that art existing. You have a goal in your mind of what you're trying to say with that art, what you want to contribute. There is a philosophy behind the work. And so I think art, I don't think it's enough to just say like, okay, well, anything that we don't need to actually survive as a species, I mean, I think we could argue that's art. Okay, fine. But I think on top of that, I think you have to take it one step further in terms of I think there must be some purpose for the existence of that art. I think that there has to be a greater meaning or goal or right. Again, doesn't have to be the most earth-shattering thing in the world. Not everybody is a Zack Snyder. I get that. As an artist, I don't think that anybody goes into the world saying, I'm just going to splatter some paint on a canvas, right? I think even the most abstract of abstract expressionists had some purpose, whether or not they wanted to talk about it. And so I think if it's something that you've created that has nothing, it in no way furthers the reproduction or survival of humanity, but it exists for its own sake, and it exists because there is some meaning or some truth or some purpose that you mean to inject into the world, then that's art.
That's a great definition. I think everybody has a little bit of a different take on that question, but I really appreciate you establishing that and sort of adding to it. So I really appreciate, Damien, your thoughts on art, on film criticism, and what it means to be a fan. I know we've run long, but I could talk to you for another 3 hours about this stuff.
Same.
It's just it's a subject matter that I am very passionate about, and I know there are other fans like you and in the Snyder fandom who do share that passion about film and about art. And so I'm glad to have this discussion with you. I appreciate your time in spending it with me. And maybe we can sort of collaborate on something again. Maybe we could make I don't know, we could make like a short, an online course or something about BBS. Maybe we could do some kind of funny video about teaching people the more scholarly aspect of that film, because I've tried to do it a little bit, but I think you have taken it into the real world, and that has a real world impact on students and on the future generation. And I think that's so important, and I'm so glad to know that you do that. And I hope that your students realize what an amazing experience that is, because if I was in school now, I would love that. So I am so glad you're doing that. And thank you for just sharing your love of these films, not only with your students, but with other people at SnyderCon, with me. And I wish we could have SnyderCon every year. I think that would have been a really great thing that we could gather together, because I think to your point earlier about how sometimes we feel like we're in the minority, sometimes we feel silenced. And so I think conversations like this make me realize, as Man of Steel says, you are not alone. And I think there are there's value in discussing these things. A friend of mine once told me that art is meant to be shared. And I think that is so true. So thank you for sharing this time with me and sharing your thoughts with me. And I hope other people find it as valuable as I did.